The lawyer read the will the way you'd read a grocery list. Straight through, no pauses. Caleb Harris is excluded from any inheritance. He didn't look up when he said it, he just turned the page. Marjorie looked at me before the paper even settled. She smiled, then caught herself and pretended to fix her necklace instead. Evan leaned back so far his chair creaked, like the meeting had already gone exactly how he expected. Someone, maybe Marjorie, let out a small breath that sounded like relief. I stayed where I was, hands folded, eyes on the table. No one asked if I was okay. No one asked if I had questions. The lawyer cleared his throat and kept reading. Assets, properties, accounts. Each one landing on the table in front of them like it belonged there. Marjorie nodded along. Evan checked his phone. They weren't listening carefully. They didn't need to. What stuck with me wasn't the sentence about me. It was how fast they moved on from it. Marjorie whispered something to Evan and they both smiled again. Not at me, at the future, at plans that were already forming while I was still in the room. I caught my name once, said softly, followed by a shrug. I didn't interrupt. I didn't remind them I was still sitting there. I remembered helping my grandfather sort paperwork late at night because no one else had time. I remembered driving him to appointments Marjorie always canceled on. I remembered Evan joking, more than once, that I was basically the help anyway. None of that came up in the room. The lawyer finally looked at me, maybe expecting something, anger, confusion, anything. I nodded instead, thanked him, stood up. Marjorie watched me gather my coat like she was watching someone leave a restaurant early. Evan didn't look up at all. They stayed seated when I walked out. That detail mattered to me more than the will itself. For this to make sense, you need to understand who my grandfather was to everyone else and who he was to me. Richard Moore built everything himself, not overnight, not by luck. Real estate first, small properties, then land no one wanted, then land everyone suddenly did. Later, a family company that handled development and leasing. By the time I was old enough to understand numbers, his name was already on buildings I passed without thinking twice. To the family, he was the patriarch. To me, he was the person who called when the printer jammed or when the TV remote stopped responding. I was the quiet one, always had been. I didn't fight for attention at holidays. I didn't interrupt conversations. I showed up, stayed late, and did what needed doing. That worked fine when my grandfather needed help. It didn't work as well with the rest of the family. Linda, my aunt, was his daughter. She liked to remind people of that. She talked about legacy a lot, about what she deserved after everything she'd been through, which usually meant divorces, bad investments, and a habit of disappearing when things got inconvenient. Her son Mark was treated like proof that the family line was secure. He could do no wrong. If he messed up, it was learning. If I did the same thing, it was a flaw. When my grandfather's health started slipping, Linda suddenly became busy. Mark was finding himself. That left me. I handled appointments, I organized paperwork, I made sure bills were paid and the house didn't quietly fall apart. I slept on the couch more nights than I can count because it was easier than driving home after he fell asleep mid-conversation. No one asked me to do any of that. No one thanked me for it either. It just became expected. What did stand out, what I didn't think much about at the time, were the questions my grandfather started asking in the last year of his life. Not sentimental ones, practical ones. He asked who could change a trust. He asked what happened if beneficiaries disagreed. He asked what counted as conduct detrimental to an estate. Sometimes he'd stop mid-sentence and say, "People show you who they are when they think it's settled," then change the subject like he hadn't said anything. I didn't push. I assumed he was planning. He always was. It wasn't until much later that those questions came back to me. That's when I realized the will wasn't written for me to win. The lawyer went back to the beginning and started reading properly this time. Formal language, section numbers, dates, amendments. The room shifted into that strange quiet where everyone pretends to listen even though they're only waiting for their part. Linda sat forward in her chair, hands folded, nodding along like this was confirmation of something she'd already decided was hers. Mark looked bored. He kept glancing at his watch, tapping his thumb against the leather band. Then my part came up again. Not much to it. A short paragraph, no assets, no property, no shares in the company. A personal item list that included a watch I'd already been wearing for years because my grandfather had given it to me early so there wouldn't be arguments later. Linda laughed, not loudly, just enough to be heard. "Well," she said, turning toward Mark, "I guess that settles that." Mark smirked and said, "Makes sense. Grandpa always knew who was really family." The lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted the stack of papers in front of him. He didn't look at either of them when he kept reading. He definitely didn't look at me. I noticed small things in that moment. how Linda's foot bounced under the table, how Mark stopped pretending to listen entirely once my name was out of the way, how the lawyer's voice sped up like he wanted to get through it without inviting questions. I stayed quiet. I didn't remind them that I'd been the one managing my grandfather's rental payments when Linda forgot how online banking worked. I didn't mention the nights I spent sleeping on a couch while Mark posted photos from bars 3 blocks away. I didn't point out that I was the one listed as emergency contact on every form. None of that was relevant to the document. By the time the lawyer finished, Linda looked satisfied. Mark looked pleased. They exchanged a glance that didn't include me at all. The lawyer finally looked in my direction, just briefly, the look people give when they expect resistance and are surprised when it doesn't come. I nodded. I thanked him. I picked up the pen he offered and signed where he pointed. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I took notes, not on the will, on them. After the will reading, things went quiet in a way that didn't need to be discussed. No argument, no official cutoff, just fewer messages, then none at all. Linda stopped calling, not even the polite check-ins she used to do when she wanted something. Mark unfollowed me online without blocking me, which felt intentional, like he wanted me to notice. Family gatherings still happened, I just wasn't told about them anymore. At first, I tried to explain it to myself as grief. Everyone handles it differently. That explanation didn't last long. Bills started stacking up, some of that was real, some of it I let look worse than it was. I didn't correct anyone when they assumed I was struggling. I didn't push back when someone mentioned I might need to figure things out now. I took extra shifts at work, I sold a few things, nothing dramatic, enough to be visible if someone was paying attention. Linda was paying attention. She mentioned, through a mutual acquaintance, that it was sad how things turned out for me, that my grandfather would have hated seeing me like this. Mark told someone I went to school with that I'd always been bad with money anyway. I didn't respond. I didn't defend myself. I let it sit. I stopped dressing the way I used to at the few places I still ran into them. I kept my head down, I looked tired because I was tired, and because it didn't hurt to let that show. People fill in blanks quickly when you don't correct them. Linda grew more relaxed. She talked more about renovations, about selling off land that had been too much hassle. Mark started acting like the company was already his, even though paperwork takes time. They spoke freely when I was around, not to me, near me, like I'd already faded into the background. That was the part I remembered my grandfather mentioning, though I hadn't understood it then. The part about people showing you who they are once they think things are settled. I let them think I was desperate. They stopped being careful around me. That's when they made the mistake my grandfather warned me about. If this sounds familiar to you, you're not alone. You can leave a like if you're still listening. There was a reason I didn't push back when things started falling apart on the surface. There was a reason I didn't correct anyone. And there was a reason I didn't stop Linda when she started talking too much. A few weeks after the will reading, I got an email I'd been expecting, though I hadn't known exactly when it would come. No subject line, just my name in the greeting and a time request. It wasn't from the lawyer who read the will. It was from someone else. Richard Moore had named a secondary executor years earlier, someone who wasn't family, someone who didn't attend holidays or listen to stories about who deserved what. I'd met him once, briefly, when my grandfather was still sharp enough to insist on introductions that didn't make sense at the time. That meeting was the first time I saw the trust documents in full, not the summary that had been read aloud, the whole thing. There were clauses that didn't distribute assets, they watched behavior, timelines, decisions. There were conditions tied to how the estate was handled, not who handled it. Sections that only activated after certain actions were taken, after sales, after transfers, after conversations that assumed no one was listening. My grandfather had been specific, almost meticulous. He'd left letters too, not emotional ones, practical ones, explaining why he'd structured things the way he did, explaining that people tend to reveal priorities when they think oversight is gone, explaining that patience was more useful than confrontation. Some of those letters were addressed to me, not because he favored me, but because he trusted me to wait. I didn't tell anyone about that meeting. I didn't change how I acted. I kept letting things slip. I kept letting Linda talk about selling land that wasn't meant to be sold yet. I kept quiet when Mark joked about stripping parts of the company for parts. I let conversations happen on speaker. I saved messages I wasn't supposed to hear. Everything my grandfather had asked about in his final year started making sense. By the time I left that office, I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't angry either. I was organized. They were wrong. Before anything changed publicly, I scheduled one more meeting. The second meeting didn't feel dramatic. No raised voices, no speeches, just paperwork. Linda and Mark showed up confident. Linda even joked about how long it had taken to wrap things up properly. Mark asked if this would finally let them move forward with the sale he'd been talking about for weeks. The attorney didn't smile. The secondary executor didn't either. The first thing explained was the freeze, not temporary, immediate. Accounts tied to the estate were locked pending review. Property transfers that had already been initiated were paused. Sales that were basically done were suddenly not done at all. Linda laughed at first, thought it was procedural. Mark asked how long it would take to fix. Then the language changed. The trust had conditions, not hidden in fine print, but placed where someone would only notice if they read carefully. Conditions tied to preservation of assets, to intent, to conduct that demonstrated responsibility rather than entitlement. The sale of certain properties without unanimous executor approval triggered a reversal clause. So did attempts to dissolve parts of the company before a required holding period expired. Conversations helped too. Messages, emails, casual remarks that assumed no oversight. The executor slid copies across the table, dates highlighted, sections referenced. No accusations, just connections. Linda stopped smiling. Mark tried to argue that intent mattered, that they were family, that everyone knew what Richard would have wanted. The executor didn't interrupt him. He waited until Mark finished, then pointed to a paragraph my grandfather had written himself. It explained that intent was exactly what mattered. Ownership of the family company reverted. Properties earmarked for liquidation returned to the trust. Control shifted away from the people who had rushed to claim it. I stayed quiet through all of it. When the attorney finally looked at me, it was to confirm signatures, nothing else. I didn't take everything. I took exactly what mattered. When the meeting ended, Linda couldn't meet my eyes. Mark didn't try. They left separately, both still holding folders they hadn't opened. I stayed behind long enough to collect copies. Then I went home. The phone call started that same evening. Linda called first. Not directly, she left a voicemail. Her voice was tight, controlled in a way that sounded practiced. She said there had to be a misunderstanding, that lawyers overcomplicate things, that families shouldn't handle business like strangers. I didn't call back. Mark texted instead. Short messages at first, confused ones, then longer ones. He asked what I thought I was doing, said I was overreacting, said this would destroy the family. When I didn't respond, the tone changed. He reminded me of favors he'd never actually done, brought up things from years ago that suddenly mattered a lot to him. A few days later, Linda tried again, this time softer. She said she'd always cared about me, said she knew things hadn't looked fair, but that we could work something out. She suggested lunch, used my grandfather's name more than once. I didn't answer. The messages turned sharper after that. Accusations, warnings, comments about lawyers they knew and what could happen if I pushed too hard. When those didn't work, the silence set in. It was abrupt, like a switch flipped. Family gatherings still happened. I heard about them later through people who didn't realize how careful they were being when they spoke. My name stopped coming up entirely. Not in anger, not in conversation, just gone. That part surprised me more than the calls. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel satisfied. Mostly, I felt lighter. The noise was gone, the constant pressure to explain myself, to prove something that was never going to be acknowledged anyway. It all disappeared at once. I missed my grandfather. I didn't miss the rest of it. Now they won't even say my name at family events, and I'm fine with that. I've had time to sit with it since then, more time than I expected. People assume moments like this come with relief that feels loud, like closure is supposed to arrive all at once and announce itself. That didn't happen. What I felt was quieter, slower, the kind of calm that only shows up when something stops pulling at you. I've asked myself whether any of this was really necessary, whether I could have walked away earlier and avoided the damage altogether, whether holding on to the trusts, the properties, the company, whether any of that mattered as much as it felt like it did in the moment. I think about my grandfather a lot now, about those questions he asked near the end, about how carefully he set things up. It's hard not to wonder if he was steering me toward this without saying it outright, if he knew exactly how people would act once they thought they were free to act however they wanted. That thought makes things complicated. He didn't tell me what to do. He didn't leave instructions saying who deserved what. He just built a structure and let everyone move inside it. What happened after that wasn't really a surprise to him, or to me once I started paying attention. There's a cost to that kind of outcome. It isn't financial, it's quieter than that. It shows up in empty chairs at holidays, in names that stop being spoken, in the realization that what you thought was family was conditional all along. I didn't win in the way people usually mean when they hear stories like this. I didn't get an apology that meant anything. I didn't get recognition for the years I showed up when no one else did. What I got was space and the truth. Some days that feels like enough. I don't tell this story because I think I'm the hero in it. I'm not even sure there is one. I made choices. Some of them were passive, some of them weren't. I could have stepped in earlier. I could have said something the first time I realized how far things were going. I knew enough to slow it down if I wanted to. I didn't. Part of that was self-preservation, part of it was exhaustion, and part of it was understanding that warning people rarely changes how they act when they believe they're entitled to the outcome. I still have my grandfather's letters. I reread them sometimes, not for validation, but to remind myself that patience was the one thing he trusted me with. Everything else was just structure. I don't talk to Linda or Mark now, not because there's a rule against it, because there's nothing left to say that would be honest without reopening something that finally closed. I didn't walk away untouched. I didn't walk away bitter either. I walked away knowing exactly where I stood and what it cost to stand there. I could have warned them. I chose not to. Would you have done the same? If you think I crossed a line, say it. If you think you would have done the same, say that too. I'm reading the comments. And if you're still here, if stories like this make you stop and think, go ahead and like the video. It helps more than you'd expect. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories where the truth comes out late and the ending isn't clean.